in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So, Mike, you've been a SWAT guy for a while, right?
Yeah, like a decade.
A couple of years. So you have not just gone through SWAT school, you have run SWAT schools. Right?
I don't know if I could claim that I've run them. I've helped and I've taught in a lot of them. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically one a year for the last 10 years, if you don't count mine.
You probably have a pretty good idea at this point, what makes a good SWAT dude and what makes a bad one or a dangerous one, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of an art and a science, I would say.
Interesting.
It's,
I like that.
You don't get it right. And
so how do you pick them?
Yeah, it's something I've thought a lot about lately as it relates to selection stuff, because we don't always get it right. I think we've got it mostly down. We've got a pretty good rhythm to it, but
is there a standard, a national SWAT standard that this is how your agency does it and how LAPD does it and how?
Not really, no. There's been some articles, NTOA has done some stuff where they talk about a physical fitness assessment, but it's just a suggestion, a recommendation. It's not a standard by any stretch. And obviously that's very regional and local and whatever else. But the lesson in all of it is that selection is the most important part of what makes a SWAT guy or gal a SWAT guy or gal, right? And even in K9, when I go look for a dog, I'm trying to pick a unicorn. I'm looking for a unicorn, right? I go and I test all these dogs. I might test 5, 10, 15, sometimes even more dogs to look for the one maybe that I'm going to bring home and hope that they do well in training. And it's because I'm looking for a dog that is social, but also not a coward, driven, but not so driven that they're out of control, independent, but also pack-oriented and loyal, confident, but not too dominant, right? You're looking for all of these traits.
I'm picturing the hot crazy scale.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a unicorn. It's literally.
Yeah.
And one of the things in thinking about this that's occurred to me is the way my team does it compared to we have I work for a municipal agency. We have our own SWAT team. There's also a county regional team that's a multi-agency team. And the way we do things is completely different than them. And it's not to make a comparison between, one is better than the other. Both work, both get good candidates, both are good teams. But obviously the key is in the execution and how you write that selection and how you come up with that process is something that you have to be very intentional about. So there's more than one way to skin that cat. But I think, again, the key is in the execution. And I would like to think that every process, including the one that we use where I'm at, has room for improvement. So I've been thinking about this a lot. And one of the things that I came across as far as where to go with this was a thought exercise, and it had to do
thinking.
It had to do with marketing a product, right? Like if I'm trying to market a product to a customer, a consumer, I want to sort of put myself in their shoes. And I kind of reverse engineered this a little bit and thought about like, well, what about a SWAT guy? And what this thought exercise was like, let's consider your consumer, or in my case, consider a SWAT guy. Like, what does a SWAT guy say or think or do or feel? And you can kind of go through those categories and brainstorm some stuff and develop, one might say, a little bit of empathy, I guess, or some insights as to the type of person that gets into these sorts of roles. So like
inside the mind of a SWAT
for
dude.
me, if I was to say like, what does a SWAT guy say? Like, what does a guy like me say? Well, I don't know. I say things like suck less, just as an example. Other guys might say things like, you gotta want it. That's one that's come up in my circles recently.
So the key to being a SWAT dude is like have a cheesy saying. Is that
obviously
is that what you do?
Obviously, right?
Okay. Well, I like this game. I like talking about me. I'm a pilot. I'll talk about me all day long. So it's says, thinks, does, feels.
Yeah.
It sounds real damn squishy. I got to be straight with you, Mike. All right.
Totally.
All right. So I like this game though because I get to talk about me. Do me.
Do you?
Well, yeah. But okay. So says.
Yeah, what's a thing a pilot, a gym type of pilot, a gym flavor pilot? What's a thing that you say in your community?
I often find myself saying, what the hell are we doing here?
I've said that actually. So I've legitimately said this too. I go like to a call, like a patrol call in my canine capacity. And I look around and I'm like, so what are we doing here? Where are we going with this?
Yeah, a little bit as like I guess looking for a task, looking for something to do, and some of it is like, what the hell are my leaders thinking?
Having a sense of purpose and direction, I think, is good.
I guess if we're taking it seriously, I think we say it's all good a lot. Like, okay, we got this under control. Cool. And that's a big part of being cool, calm, and collected is a big deal for us, right? Even when things are going weird and the airplane's not cooperating or the weather's not cooperating, like, no, it's all good. We got this. We're going to go.
Yeah. One of my team leaders recently brought back a thing from a conference, and it was straight up stolen from the Blue Angels. I'm not going to lie. But it's the glad to be here thing. Mm-hmm. And it's a similar concept. Like, we can have a bad day. We can walk away with a black eye. We can fuck something up. We can have a bad outcome. But, at the end of the day, like, we're glad to be here. And having some gratitude for doing the kinds of things that we get to do, I think says a lot about our team and our culture.
Something you hear a lot in the military in general is living the dream.
Yeah.
How you doing? Living the dream. Well, nightmares are also dreams.
Yeah.
But there's something you said about that. Like, even if I'm up to my eyeballs in shit, like, no, it's cool. I'm living the dream. It's all good, right?
Yeah. What about things that you think? Like, for me, I know one would be like, man, I got to step my game up. I always feel behind on something. Like, I'm thinking about, I'll be doing well with like shooting and getting out to the range and doing stuff. And then I'm like, man, my PT's slacking. I gotta step my game up there. Or I'll go do that. And I'm like, someone will mention an incident to me. I'm like, dude, I haven't read anything about that incident. I need to read up on that. There's always something that I'm like behind on. I got to step my game up. That's something that I think
I like that. There's a type of self-awareness, knowing what you're weak on and thinking about it and doing something about it. I think that's a big deal. I think a lot like, what am I missing here? Looking around the airplane, like the worst is when everything is like working really well on the plane. And you're like, what are you hiding? What are you hiding, girl? Yeah. And a big part of that for me is you look for hazards. You look, what's the thing that's going to kill me next? What do I need to do next? What's next?
Yeah. And a thing that you do. What is a thing that you do? What do you do here? What is it that you do?
What did you say it is you do here? Well, when I'm flying the plane, a lot of that, I think, is prioritizing what's important right now. There are lots of things trying to get my attention. The radio's squawking, the little flashy lights are doing their little flashy light thing. And having a sense of like what matters right now. What can I actually control? What can I do to make my situation better right now is a big thing. And in any given phase of flight, I've got my little things going through my head of what I'm trying to get done, right? So like on a landing, on an approach to landing, it might be airspeed, aim point, vertical velocity. And just going through those and processing what I'm seeing on my instruments over and over and over. And then like if shit gets busy or weird on the plane, it's always aviate, navigate, communicate. And that's not just something I'm thinking, it's something I'm actively trying to do, right? And then whether I'm in the plane or in the office, I am always communicating. Like always. Talking on the radio, talking to my crew, making PowerPoints because I'm an officer. We do important office work. And it's funny, like I come home and my wife wants to talk and I'm like, I have been talking for the last 14 hours straight. I need to like stare at my phone for a little bit, which she loves, as you can imagine.
Yeah. I things that I do, one thing that a lot of people I think in my community do is stuff on their own time. And that implies some sense of like personal responsibility, but like we might be tinkering with gear on our own time. We might be doing dry fire stuff or going to the range on our own time, or physical fitness is something that often happens on our own time, reading up on things. Those are always things. The what's important now thing has actually been popularized in LE circles. There was a whole movement over, and of course they had to acronym. It was win. What's important now?
Lame.
Yeah. Well, but it applies. Like you have to do the same sort of thing. So I think those are all things that certainly fit. And then things that we feel like, yeah, that one's a little tricky. Like you said, it's warm and fuzzy. What do you feel? Tell me about your feelings, Jim.
Oh, goodness. Well, contrary to popular belief, pilots are capable of lots of feelings, mostly for and about ourselves. To try to answer that seriously, like I feel responsibility. I feel the responsibility for my plane, for my crew, for the outcome of the mission. Like it's on me. There's memes on the internet like no one's coming, it's up to us. Like
yep.
At the end of the day, I'm the A code. Like on the orders, they put a little A next to my name. It says, hey, you own this plane today. You own this crew today. Don't screw it up. Right? Like, and I have a saying a lot lately, going back to things I say, that my job would be easy if I didn't have to care about the outcome. But I own that outcome. I own that landing. I own whatever our mission was that day.
Yeah. The bag holder.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I feel is mostly like lower back pain most of the time.
Out of breath.
Yeah. Yeah. Anger. Like, I'm kidding. Sort of. No, I think that's a good point. I think also like a competitive spirit. Like, I feel like you mentioned the no one's coming, it's up to us. Like we got to be the best at this, because at the end of the day, in this city, in this town, if something like this happens, we're the guy. Like, we're the guys that do the thing, right? And so like having that like nature about us, where like we have to be the best ones in the agency to be capable of handling this problem, is similar in that sense of responsibility. And I think that's where this exercise takes us, is that like, what are the insights that these thoughts give us? And particularly if I'm trying to find people like us, how do I market to them? How do I recruit them and select them, the people that say and do and think and feel the way that we do about the mission or the task? And from a marketing standpoint, from a recruiting standpoint, I think that's helpful, right? Because it speaks to the culture and the ethos of the group.
It's interesting. It's insightful. But a question you have to ask is, do you want everyone on your team to say, do, think, feel the exact same things Mike does, right?
Well, and right, like we want an army of Mikes running around, obviously.
Yeah,
No.
that would be awesome.
Yeah. No, but it's the aggregate, right? Like if I pull the room, I took the entire team, hey, what are the things that you all collectively say, do, think, feel? That is where the insight might come. And you might be able to find some common threads. And not everyone has to be precisely the same, and that's okay. And we'll get to diversity later. But it's one of those things that like you can sit there and go like, okay, yeah, that guy might not say, think, or do what I say, think, or do, but it's compatible with our type, right?
I like that. So when I think about selecting for any special team, SWAT team, Special Forces team, super secret ninja team, whatever the team is, the primetime team at a restaurant, the guys who are actually working, the busy shift.
The A-team.
The A-team, yeah. When I think about that, this is fundamentally a talent management thing. This is a management thing. And I have noticed that a lot of managers and commanders and leaders seem to suck at this. Who is in charge of HR for your special team? Is it the team commander? Is there someone whose job is to do that, this side of it? And think through all the things that involves, like how many operators do you need? How do you split them up? Which is there a red team and a gold team and a blue team? Or is everyone just one thing? How much specialization do you do? How do you recruit those people? How do you make people want to sign up? Are you just relying on SWAT's cool? That'll get you so far. It'll also get you one very specific segment
Type of
demographic,
guy.
right?
Yeah, type of guy.
Yeah. How do you select them? Of those applicants, how do you pick who you put through training and who you encourage to maybe come back later after they've grown up a little bit? And who do you weed out and say, this is not for you, or you are not for us? And then once you got them, how do you build them into proficient, seasoned, capable operators? And then how do you keep them? How do you keep them from getting injured, from getting killed, from quitting, from going to another agency?
Being burnt out, yeah.
Just being burnt out. So how do you retain them? And then how do you return them? When it is time to offboard, and everyone someday will offboard, how do you handle that? How do you do it in a healthy, helpful way, in a way that ideally not only helps that operator, but helps your organization in the long run? Maybe they go become your talent scouts looking for the next generation, right? Maybe they go run your training program. Or maybe they just retire and ride off into the sunset, and that's cool as long as they're doing it in a healthy, happy way, right?
Yeah, and I think the whole life cycle thing is an important angle to consider because this entire process will feed itself, right? If you select the right people, you are going to get smart, intelligent people that are going to help the whole process get better. And Jim mentioned, like, you might attract the guy that just think SWAT's cool, right? Like, oh, we go do cool shit. Like, there's people that come into our SWAT testing and selection process that didn't even know prior to getting there that we use explosives to open doors and blow holes through walls sometimes. Like, they didn't even know that was a thing that we did. And I mean, maybe we should advertise that better because, like, it's cool. But also, there are people who might have a knack for stuff like that maybe we're not tapping. So the whole process will feed itself. If you get the right people in the door, it will improve the whole thing. And specifically, when your people who go back to like Gen Pop become the mentors and the recruiters, like Jim was saying, the talent scouts, you're going to get better candidates because they're going to nudge them in the right direction and do some of the work for you without even you realizing it sometimes. On the retention angle, you have to consider that longevity piece. Like, sometimes you're going to get the dudes who are the sprinters, that they come in and they're all in, right? And they're going to last maybe 5 years, maybe 10, they might 7, 8, something like that. Usually until they get married and have kids, something like that. It's like a big landmark. And that's fine, right? Like sometimes you want the guys that are the sprinters, but also you need some continuity and some consistency. And sometimes that means you need the long timers, the lifers, right? And so you have to ask yourself, like, is this only a young man's sport? Or do we want to invest in people and build that longevity into it so they're around for the long haul?
Yeah, the answer is probably both. And
absolutely,
those sprinters bring a lot of energy, and you kind of need that energy. And you also need the guys who are going to keep the lights on long term, right? And I think about that in the military context. And the military, as it happens, actually puts a ton of thought into this. The Marine Corps, in general, is a very young service. Most Marines are between 18 and 22. Most enlistments aren't that long relative to a 20-year career. And we want them that way. We want them young, slightly pissed off, ready to get whole, ready to kill something, right? Go charge that beach and don't think too much about it. Just go, right? Compare that to a special forces team. We need those guys to be able to go in, do cross-cultural communications, win hearts and minds, handle real squishy situations, kind of gray stuff. Now, when push comes to shove, they got to be able to shove back. And so they do have to have that physical fitness, and they have to have that drive, and they have to be able to win the fight.
And also, they're in some pretty precarious situations. So,
yeah, they got to be able to repel borders, but they're also not typically 18 to 22. They tend to be late 20s, early 30s, some into their 40s. And consider what that means back in a SWAT scenario, right? Sometimes you need those. You send the 800-pound gorilla to go do 800-pound gorilla things, and sometimes you send the thinkers in. And ideally, you get that unicorn, right? The guy who can do the 800-pound gorilla work when it's time to do that, and the guy who can do the cerebral work when it's time to do that.
Yeah, and I think that if you want someone who is going to inject energy into your program, that's a worthwhile thing. And also sometimes you want to look at someone that's just calm. I think calmness is one of those metrics that you can look at versus someone who's just chaotic. It's one thing. That's not the same thing as being aggressive, right? You can be aggressive, but also a generally calm person. I've seen guys that can hit the gas and go sprint into a gunfight, but they do it in a very deliberate, quiet, calm way, right? They're not just their hair's on fire. Oh my God, I have to run and save the children. It's surgical, right? And so being calm and having energy, those are important things to consider what your metric is on that. And the thing is we usually have some sort of established selection or hiring process. And for most people, what does that look like? I assume for most special teams in my line of work, it probably involves something like a PT test, a physical fitness standard of some form. There's probably a shooting qualification. Most agencies probably do an interview or something like it. We stopped doing it, but that's another topic. Where the problems arise is when we look at what that process looks like, and we say with the PT test, shooting qualification, interview. Is that getting, or is that capturing the people that we're actually looking for? Are those the good candidates? Are those the people that we want? Do they make it? And one of the reasons that we mostly moved away from doing interviews, oral boards, or panel style interviews was people would come in and smoke the oral board, and then they'd come to the school, which was also a selection, and they'd shit the bed. And so we're well, we don't really eliminate people for the interview. Yeah, we do it. We go through the motions, and then they get to the school, and that's where the cuts happen, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what are the things that really matter? Is your max bench press the metric? Is it a shooting score, like a qualification standard? Is that it? Like, oh, you can shoot so well, so therefore you're going to be a great SWAT guy? And I would offer probably not. Is it your run time, right? Like, or is there something better that we can be measuring? And if so, how do we measure it? What's the standard?
And how did you even get to those standards in the first place, right? How good of a shooter do you need to be? Is it a 3x5 card at 100 meters within, 0.5 seconds? Is that the standard? Or, and why? What anatomical, physiological reason are we going for that? What tactical reason? What lessons are we going? Same with physical fitness, and run times and all that. And the thing is, when we're dealing with metrics, those are, what's the word? They're enticing to leaders because they are fair and they're quantifiable and they're objective and they do tell us some valuable information. In fact, quite a bit, right? But they're also kind of bullshit. They tell us a little about how committed the candidate is to self-improvement. They tell us a little about the fact that you can do a task. But the thing is, I can fix some of that stuff with training and preparation, right? How prepared do you want that candidate to be before they walk through the door? Do they have to be a full-up seasoned operator when they walk through the door? Well, then why is there a U? Why is there a training process? Okay. And I can make you stronger. I can improve your bench press. I can make you a better shooter. I can make you better at landing an airplane. What I can't do is make you not an asshole. And that, like with the interview thing, I understand there are limitations to an interview, but you can kind of engineer an interview to bring that out of people. And I would offer that maybe with some of this stuff, it's kind of more have them do an escape room or a leadership reaction course versus have them do a mile run. Also have them do a mile run. Maybe have them do a mile run before or after doing the escape room thing.
It's funny because we used to do, as part of our testing process, we actually had a selection day that we used to do that was a bunch of scenarios. And again, what we found was that people that do really well in the scenarios come to the school, which is like a longer contact time, more exposure. And you'd see the flaws in the schools that you didn't see in the selection. But so we stopped doing those. But back in the day, when I tested, there was actually a test that was exactly like that, where you had to like go into this shoot house and like there was an officer calling for assistance and you had to go help him, and it turned into this like big old gun battle. And you got into this back room where the guy was, and it was engineered, you're out of ammo. And so hopefully you're thoughtful enough to like take his ammo, and you start rendering care to the officer, and it turns out you're locked in this part of the shoot house. They locked you in there, and
it's just you and a hacksaw.
Yeah, and it was a timed event, right? And it was like there was one of the bad guys that you killed had keys on him that you had to go find, and it was this whole problem solving thing. So it's just funny that you bring up the escape room thing, but yeah, like you said, the discipline that comes from a person who is physically fit, right? Like you pass it, you do well on a PT score. That tells me that you have the discipline to like get up in the morning and go work out and do those things. If you have a degree, like, and I'm just I've got a high school diploma and a couple college credits. I don't have any degrees or anything like that, but someone who has completed a degree, like has demonstrated that they can see a long-term project through to the end, right? There are things that tells us that are more squishy than the certificate themselves, right? Or the score themselves. On the a-hole thing, like don't be an asshole, it's important to ask yourself and your team, like what are the sorts of things that keep people out of our team? Or what are the sorts of things that will get someone removed from our team? And a big part of this is just generally having standards and having an expectation of excellence and growth in your team, in the culture of your team. And that's something that you kind of have to breed into it. And it's part of the indoctrination process. And sometimes your selection is also an indoctrination process when you select and you onboard someone, right, you're trying to build them into this new program that's different from something else, whatever that is, right? And so like we have a saying on my team, like you're always on probation. Just because you made it through SWAT school, just because we brought you on the team, that doesn't mean you've made it, dude. Like, yeah, you're here and we're happy you're here and hopefully you're glad to be here. But also, like, that's a fragile thing. And so like don't get too cocky about it, you know? And so when we consider what we're looking for in a candidate, there are certain assumptions that we can make. And there's certain things that we have to watch out for. So we can assume that a person that's done well on a shooting qualification knows the fundamentals, right? They know how to align their sights and work a trigger and have a good grip. That's fine. Can we also assume that person will always handle a firearm safely, especially if we're not on a flat range? I think that's a false assumption. If you're assuming that because someone's able to do really good holes in paper, that they're also a very safe gun handler, you're misguiding yourself. And so like part of that process of what assumptions are we making is what can we expect or assume that the people will know when they show up and they walk through the door? Like Jim said, are they already supposed to be an operator? So map these things out and say like, hey, I expect these things out of our candidates. They should know use of force law and policy and procedure. They should know basic firearm safety and handling. Those are all things they've been taught before. We can verify that they've been taught those things before. And if they don't practice those things, it's easy to measure that and say like, hey, that's not acceptable. We're going to remove you from the process. And then once you've established those things, what do you expect to teach them when they get there? And despite what might be on the formal selection process or the test, right? Like there's got to be certain things that are non-negotiable. So I expect that if I'm teaching somebody a new skill that they're going to make mistakes and that there's a learning curve. That's fine, right? But there's got to be certain things that we're also looking for that it's like, yeah, I don't expect you to know hostage rescue tactics. But going back to like the don't be an asshole thing, I also expect you to have like a winning spirit and not just be like, fuck it and throw your hands up and throw a little temper tantrum. Those things, stuff like that should be non-negotiable.
Yeah. And fundamentally, you need to know when you're training and when you're evaluating. Are you always doing both? Are you training up front and then testing? Are you testing up front and then training? Mike mentioned, you're always on probation. That's a culture that you can choose to have on your team. There are alternative cultures you can choose to have. Hey, you're here. You are one of the people who owns the place, right? And it's important to know, like, what standard do we as a team always hold ourselves to, and what will get you taken off of the team if you screw it up. And that should be kind of understood. And there's the written rules and the unwritten rules. But think about making that clear.
We got to highlight that, I think. The written rules and the unwritten rules. So this is really hard because like in civil service processes, like law enforcement, public safety in general, like you're a city employee, there's equal opportunity and all this stuff. And it's really hard to enforce unwritten stuff. So take some time, again, on the assumptions front, like to consider what unwritten things are part of our culture and how can we codify that some way that empower us to make those decisions and keep those people out. Yeah, that's important.
And what are the things we forgive and what are the things we don't forgive? And that can be big stuff like integrity kinds of things, or it could be just like no whining. It could be, how do you as a team handle things like negligent discharges? How do you handle fratricide in like a simunition force on force kind of scenario?
Yeah.
What do you do about it? Right.
One that comes to mind is like shit talking. Like how do you handle like if you start bad mouthing someone and they're not in the room, or you badmouth another team or another agency, a way that someone else did something, right? Like, how do you handle that? And it doesn't have to, like, this is the written and the unwritten thing is, does that mean like you remove someone from the process or kick them off the team? No, it's not necessarily about that. It's also just, what do you tolerate? And like culturally, we can be like, nah, dude, that we ain't about that. Like, to think that we can't make a mistake like that tomorrow or the next day is absurd. Yeah. So be careful with that.
And, there are things you can fix and things you can't. And you have to be clear-eyed about which one you're seeing in a candidate. You can fix a lot of stuff. But like, you're never going to make someone's personality do a 180. You can make it, change a couple degrees, but you're probably not going to get the 180.
Yeah. And I think having a sober look at this is important because you want to be careful about limiting your pool of potentially really good applicants for silly things. Like, I want our shooting qualification to be like really, really hard, or our PT test to be like really, really hard because PT is important and firearms is important. Well, maybe you're limiting yourself because, again, like, I can fix a lot of that, right? They tell me something about a person, but I can make them a better shooter and have a better PT score. Like, what I need to see is a baseline level of proficiency and safety to show that, like, when I start teaching them advanced tactics, I don't have to go back to like, all right, let's go over to the range and shoot paper again, because we don't have time for that, right? It's not just arbitrary. We do need that shooting proficiency to be at some baseline, right? But we're also not just keeping people out because like of elitism, because we're just trying to be difficult for the fuck of it. Like just cuz, right? And the other thing is, there are going to be times during that training process where I get the opportunity to see how coachable someone is. And maybe like they're not that great of a shooter, or their PT does need improvement, and I want that. Like, I want the opportunity to teach them some things, because that lets me measure something that's a little bit more nuanced, like how do they take feedback? Will they improve over time, right? Like, how do they not only accept criticism, but take that coaching that I give them and implement that, right? Like that, I think that says something about a person that a qualification raw score can't. And this is another place where considering Jim's concept that he talks about the life cycle of talent is important, because although there's certain things that I might be able to build someone up to before the selection process occurs, part of that selection and recruiting process might also involve training opportunities to set people up for success. Mm-hmm. So how can I mentor them and give them the opportunities that they need to meet those standards? Like, there's no secrets, right? Our shooting qualification, the max score is a 250. You need a 210 to qualify for Arizona Post and a 230 to be on SWAT. No secrets there. You know what the test is. You shouldn't be in a fair fight with that test, right? If you need help meeting that standard, we will help you get there. There's no secrets. So you can build that into the process ahead of time and say, like, all right, we have a mentorship program that we do at my agency with my team. People who are interested in eventually testing for SWAT can come be in the mentorship program. They get to come out and be role players. We run range days for them. We do workouts with them, all those things. I think those are worthwhile to build into it. So yeah, having an arbitrarily high standard just for the sake of doing it is one thing. Like, yeah, sure, you're a USPSA Grandmaster Sensei or whatever, black belt, I don't know. But is that the metric that gives us the guys or the gals that we want? And in this context, like looking at someone who is coachable and has a growth mindset versus someone that can shoot or PT really well, those are different things. And like Jim said, like things that you can fix and things you can't. Someone might eventually become a Grandmaster Sensei black belt USPSA shooter. I don't know. But if they're not coachable, if they don't have a growth mindset, that's a lot harder to fix. And if I'm being totally honest with you, shooting is such a small part of my job that like being a super accurate, fast shooter is only one bit of it. It's a tiny little piece of the puzzle.
Mike, don't you have a story about that? Like there was a guy you were with when you were like an FTO or something, and he was a rock star shooter on the range. And then like in real life, not so much.
Yeah. So this dude, in a nutshell, like was having problems with like stress management. And so there was a legit officer involved shooting. It was not the first incident that put him on the radar. And it was also not the last. There were other things that drew attention to this guy that sent him to remedial training. But there was also an officer involved shooting where he fired a lot of rounds really, really fast. And like none of them hit what they were intended to hit. Oh, and there was like an apartment complex in the background. And
Whoops.
For whatever reason, he goes back to the academy, he does some remedial training, and at some point, like someone at the academy, Danimal, who's been on this podcast before, he was running training out there at the time, and he was like, "Hey, dude, can you take this dude on a ride with you and mentor him a little bit and just see what you think?" And he rode with me for a night, and he tells me about this. He's like, "I just don't understand. Like, I missed all these rounds in that real life shooting, and I just don't get it. Like, I go to the range all the time, I shoot a lot, I train a lot. I'm a pretty good shooter. I always ace the qual. And for whatever reason, like this happened." And I'm like, well, if you're such a good shooter, but you struggle in these other areas like managing stress or physical fitness or hand-to-hand stuff like fighting, then why are you spending so much time at the range? Like there's all these other things that you can be working on. Why is that your focus? And that's something that like maybe in an interview you could get out of somebody, right? If someone only wants to be in that like positive feedback loop of I'm a good shooter and therefore I go to the range all the time because it reinforces the fact that I'm a good shooter, what growth is happening, right? Like that's not demonstrating much to me in my eyes. So you have to ask yourself, like, what are the things that I can shape and influence about this person? And am I trying to force this square peg into a round hole? And I think for that guy in particular, it's like, yeah, you're a good shooter. That doesn't make you a good police officer, though.
Yeah. I want to go back to the interview thing real quick, because you mentioned your agency doesn't do them anymore and wasn't getting the results they needed. And I accept that. I would also offer, like I said, you can engineer that interview to get you more bang for your buck. And one is you bring the psych docs in, kind of have them help you, and you can make it as thorough as you want based on how much, kind of what your threshold is for those square pegs. If they're really, really square pegs, you can often find that in the interview, right? And consider like there's some things the psych docs might be able to pull out of people that maybe you can't. For example, in the special operations communities, one of the things they often look for are like people who had to overcome like a tough upbringing or, some major event when they were growing up. They had to get over that. And that's one of the things that we have found in the U.S. SOF community, gets you that grit that gets you through a lot of the other stuff.
That's something that came up in my psych exam as well to be a police officer. And it had a lot to do with like, oh, you were raised by a single mom. You were the oldest sibling of younger sisters. Those things all played into like, do I fit the mold more or less? And the interview process thing is interesting because we stopped doing them for SWAT because we have the opportunity to bring them into SWAT school where we get more exposure time and we get to measure a lot of those squishy dimensions over.
Your SWAT school is one really long interview.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we stopped doing them for the selection for the school. We also stopped doing them to hire cops to begin with, which I actually think is absurd. And they stopped because, again, we weren't getting enough applicants, and so therefore we weren't eliminating anyone from the interviews, and so they saw it as a waste of time. And I think that there's a lot of things that we're probably bringing candidates and we're investing into them, bringing them into the academy, and there's things that like maybe would have been picked up on in the way that they answered some of those questions. So the problem with the interview in that case was they weren't being used to select or eliminate people. They were only being used to rank people. And in the hiring process, if you're ranking people and you have 30 positions and only 16 apply, it doesn't matter what your rank is, you're probably getting a job, right? So that's the difference, is like if you're only trying to fill seats, that's one thing. But if you're trying to select the right people for the job, that's another. And there's a quantity versus quality component that I think you have to weigh into that.
Yeah. Now, if you're going to do a long interview, right, the weeks of training and you're going to be evaluating throughout that whole process, one thing you can tap is peer reviews. So you have other members of the class narc each other out. And the way you couch that is important. You have to say, hey, yeah, it is very much in your interest to be as honest as you can be on this, because you're trying to pick people to be on the life raft with you. And you want to be real thoughtful about it. And like in flying, you might literally end up on a life raft with those people. And you got to figure out, is this someone I'm going to have to eat on the life raft, or someone who's going to try to eat me on the life raft?
We might vote to throw them off.
Yeah. And I would suggest, do a couple of those peer evaluations. Do one at the beginning, kind of one in the middle, and one at the end. And you're going to see a lot of things. You're going to see that forming, storming, norming stuff across that training process. Guys who think each other are a bunch of a-holes in the first week, at the very end might be like, I would kill and die for that dude. He's the best dude ever. Or vice versa, right? The guy who maybe has a really good first impression, it turns out he is not the guy you want having your back. And so having a couple of those over the course of the program, and you don't necessarily weed people out just on that, but it can give you a lot of insight, stuff that the cadre doesn't necessarily see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think peer evaluations is a big deal. We stole that and incorporated that into our process at SWAT school. All of our guys do peer evaluations, and we've gotten a lot of value out of that for sure.
Yeah. Another thing that I think is worth hitting is diversity. And people in my generation, usually when we hear diversity, we roll our eyes like, that's not what I mean. In this context, diversity is like having a couple different types of talent, having a couple different ways of solving problems. Getting that mix of personalities is actually really important. You don't want clones. And you got to look for that, right? So if all you're doing is looking for a certain shot qualification, a certain runtime, that doesn't necessarily get you what you need.
Right. The right people, the type of person, doesn't mean that they all have to be the same person. So let's say, hypothetically, you find yourself on a life raft. Consider all the types of problems that might come up. Maybe someone on that raft is good at navigating or like sailing or whatever. I don't know how much say you get and where you go on a life raft, but maybe someone with some sense of direction would be helpful, right? Maybe there's a clever handyman. If there's a leak in that life raft and you need to patch that and you need to improvise a little bit, that could be helpful.
Having a MacGyver. Having someone who can fish would probably be helpful.
Right. Or
someone who can fight sharks would probably be helpful.
Or if we end up on land somewhere, like someone who can build a fire or build a shelter could be useful. So to that end, like, are those the skills you need to measure? Like, can you build a fire? Can you sail? Can you navigate? No, but maybe just general resourcefulness. That might be an important attribute to look for.
Comic
problem
relief.
solving. What's that?
Comic relief.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Positive attitude goes a long way, right? Can you problem solve? Can you identify new places to look for solutions? Can you troubleshoot things? One of my favorite's not the right word. One of my most annoying things I deal with especially people that are a little bit older than me, but not that much, is I'm having this computer problem. You're good with computers because you're young. And it's no, you just need to keep fucking with it and you'll figure it out, dude. I don't know that much about computers. I just fuck with it long enough until I get it to work. And so I think like having that like problem solving, troubleshooting state of mind is a big thing. So like maybe your selection process needs to have difficult or nearly impossible problems to solve. Maybe that's something you can measure that matters more. Another one, speaking of being like stranded on a life raft, is resilience. Are the people that you're hiring willing and able to embrace the suck? And can they cope with failure? And can they work through challenges? This is hard to measure in an interview, again, because someone can pick the story they want to say. They can say like, oh yeah, actually there's this one time back in my glory days when I played football in high school that I was really tough before I started overeating and not working out and all these other things, right? But maybe like as part of my process, I want to put some obstacles in their way and actually be able to see how they manage those things and what their attitude's like while they do it. Like, do they like grit their way through it and like, all right, fuck this, like whatever. I'm just going to keep, I'm angry about it, but like I'll do it, like whatever. Or are they like, hoorah, motherfuckers, like let's get some, like we're going to win this thing. Like putting them in difficult or impossible situations can tell us a lot about their attitude and their grit, right? Their tenacity. Are they willing to put in the work? Will they keep trying even if their efforts seem futile? Will they give up? Like selection processes that require people to either stick it out or ring the bell, those actually go somewhere in my mind. And that's tough because even though we want people to succeed and we want to build them up and coach them and mentor them through some things, we also need to evaluate some of those attributes. And if you make it too easy, everyone does it, everyone makes it, everyone succeeds. And you will not have something that is special or unique or elite or whatever it is you're trying to build into the ethos of your team. You're not going to get there if you just let everyone in the door, right? So you have to run the risk of getting some things wrong. And maybe at times that means saying no to somebody that should have been there, right? And maybe it's not always a no. Maybe it's just not right now. Like, hey, dude, like we're just not sure about you, right? That's an obstacle you can put in front of someone. Like, yeah, you might be all right, but we're not sure. So like maybe come back and try again. And seeing if they actually do. See, that tells you something about their attitude and their resilience, right? And to be willing to accept that risk, I think, is the cost of being selective in things like this. And I think if you want something special, you have to be willing to do that and willing to say that. And I also think that if you set up that whole life cycle thing that Jim talked about well, one is you'll find that like people will find a way. The right people that should be there will find a way, right? I didn't make it through my first SWAT school and they weren't sure about me. And I remember the guys told me after I made it through the next time I tried, they were like, hey, I wasn't sure you had the heart for this and you proved me wrong. It's like, all right, cool. Like you didn't know. And I'd rather you be willing to say no than just take me just because I met the requirement, right? Like I'd rather you be sure. And a lot of times the only way you get that is by putting a brick wall in front of somebody's face and saying like, hey, these brick walls are here for a reason. Sometimes they keep the people out who shouldn't be here. And other times they show us how bad people want something if they're willing to get over it. And maybe they'll come back and surprise you.
I like that. It's heartwarming. One of the characteristics that we need to look for when we're talking about consequential jobs is maturity. And this is tough, right? We talked about those 18-year-old Marines. Charge that beach. Don't think too much about it. Just go, right? And we need a little bit of that. We need some risk comfort, right? But we also need people who know when to push and when not to. And immature team leaders in the military have this habit of like not knowing when to pull their guys back. And that's one of the ways you know the mature ones from the not mature ones. And one of the classic stories from the Air Force on this, we talk about it in the context of flight discipline, that we don't do hot dogging. we all try to impress ourselves in our own ways because we're pilots. It's what we do. But at the end of the day, screwing around with the airplane is like not a thing that we do. And there's that ethos is written in blood. One of the classic examples is the Fairchild B-52 crash. So in that scenario, and you can watch YouTube videos of it, it's pretty horrifying. A B-52 was getting ready to do an air show. Big airplane, if you're not familiar, it's the size of a big airliner. And they're doing air show maneuvers. So real tight turns and real steep pull-ups, that kind of thing. And it was being flown by a evaluator pilot, like the senior evaluator pilot for the base. And a pretty select crew, because a lot of guys didn't want to fly with the guy because he was known for being kind of a jack-off, kind of a hot dog. And sure enough, he was hot dogging that day. And so all the families were there watching their service members getting ready for the air show, and they're video recording it. And this guy wraps it up past 90 degrees of bank. And at that point, little lesson in physics here, wings lift the airplane in the direction perpendicular to the wings. So when you tilt those wings sideways or past sideways, they're pulling the plane down, and nothing is pulling the plane up. And the plane did a wing over into the ground. Big fireball, terrible tragedy, awful day. And kind of ever since then, there was a lot of the Air Force saying, look, that's not what we want. We don't let that happen here. Has it happened since? Yes. But generally speaking, we don't want that. We want to see flight discipline. And whatever the equivalent of that is for you in a SWAT capacity, law enforcement capacity, I want you to find that. That you don't have to take yourself super seriously, but you got to take the job seriously. You got to understand this is a consequential job. You got to be risk comfortable, and you have to have the sense to know when to go and when to pull it back. But that's a thing I want to see, or at least want to see guys trying to get it right. You know, we can tweak that, we can critique it, but I want people trying to ride that line.
And the thing about maturity is it's not just about time or tenure. Like Jim said, like that guy made it all the way to this like chief evaluator role or whatever. And somehow, some way he got cocky, or maybe he was already cocky and he just kept getting away with it, right? His circles, the culture that he was in specifically allowed that. And certainly in police work, we see people all the time who get promoted for all the wrong reasons, and now they're in charge. They're our bosses, right? So the thing about maturity is like measuring that isn't about time on, it's not about rank. It's reflected in your decision making and the insight that steers those things, right? Like it's dealing with competing priorities. It's having an appreciation for nuance and trade-offs. That is what maturity really encapsulates. That's more than just like, oh, he's been doing this for a long time. And as it relates to decision making, one of the things that like I really want to see in people that I'm trying to pick is decisiveness. Like what is their willingness to make a decision? With what level of commitment are they willing to be like, hey, this might be wrong. I might not have this, but I'm bringing everything to bear that I have in this problem, and this is my decision. Go, send it.
Just going to send it. So it's a thing where I think a little bit, this is a thing you can suss out a little bit in an interview. Have you ever heard of the trolley problem where like you're on a train and you've got like a switch, and if you don't do anything, the train's going to run over 10 people. But if you flip the switch, you made the train go run over one person. And it's this big ethical, philosophical dilemma.
And there's variations to it, right? So like,
oh yeah.
So like the fundamental part of it is if you do nothing, 5 people die. If you do something, 1 person dies, but you did it.
And there's a lot of funny memes about it too. Maybe that'll be like the cover for this episode.
But like, so fundamentally you could say like, well, it makes sense that like I would only let 1 person die instead of 5 people die. So I'm going to flip the switch, even though I did it. Well, what if that flipping that switch also sends you off a cliff? There's like, so now like they die, but also you die, but you save 5 people.
What if frogs had wings?
Yeah. What if?
Then they wouldn't bump their asses when they jump.
What if?
I know. It's crazy.
It's the trolley problem. If you Google the trolley problem, you'll see all the variations. It's a fascinating experiment.
But what you need to know from an interview is I've never met a pilot or a senior operational commander who can't answer that question in like under a second. Like, oh yeah, flip the switch. Or obviously. No, don't. Right? Yeah. Whatever their answer is, they have an answer. And even if it means being wrong. And the other thing I want to see is initiative. Is this person going to sit there and wait to be told what to do? And can I train for that? Can I help encourage initiative? Yes, of course I can. And that's a big part of what we do in this show. But there are some people who will just sit there. They will go out of their way to just sit there. They think they're helping by just sitting there. I do not want them in a job of consequence. I want people who are like, yep, in the absence of orders, I'm going to go find something and kill it or save it or whatever.
Yeah. Inaction is also a choice. Mm-hmm. Doing nothing is a decision. And part of being decisive is how people handle risk. So what are they willing to put on the line if they're wrong? And this is part of like not only being decisive, but the initiative thing too, is consider when is it appropriate to throw the first punch, right? Like some dude's squaring up with you at the bar, talking shit. What's your threshold at which you're willing to make the first move? Or maybe in your dating life, like follow me for more dating tips. No, don't do that. I'm kidding. But like, you're kind of reading the room, right? You're risking rejection and embarrassment if you make the first move with a girl or a guy, whatever. And so the whole thing is like, how are they handling risk? And I think if you're willing to accept some risk, knowing that there is some worthwhile reward, we have a saying in my community, risk a lot to save a lot. If I know this is like a legitimate hostage rescue type of event, and like, this is what I signed up to do, and if I'm going to go down in a gun battle, this is the one, right? Risk a lot to save a lot. If you're willing to accept some risk knowing that there's a worthwhile reward, I think there's a good way of assessing someone's maturity and decisiveness and initiative, right? In that process. And speaking of interviews, I think scenarios like this are also a good opportunity to examine someone's thought process. Jim talked about all the things that go through a pilot's mind on like the final approach of a landing, right? He's like air altitude, landing spot, whatever, like vertical speed. I don't remember them all. Jim, this
close
is
enough.
Yeah.
You're ready to be a pilot.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Obviously.
Obviously.
Like consider diving into conversations like that with a person. And that's not just an interview. Like that's not just a screening thing, right? Like we do this constantly in the culture of my team. You hear this in every debrief that we do. Hey, like walk me through your thought process on why you did X instead of Y. And there's an important metric in this that is, it's not whether you did X or Y, it's why, right? Like, why did you do those things? What was going through your mind? And if I'm using that as a metric for evaluating a potential candidate, one of the things that I'm looking for is someone who's detail oriented, someone who is not so much getting fixated on things that don't matter, like, oh, this one detail I was like super focused and tunneled in on, but they demonstrate a level of focus and some organized thoughts. And also part of the debrief will also help us figure out like, how do they handle the feedback and the criticism if we disagree with them?
Yeah. I like how do they handle being debriefed? You know, we use the term coachable a lot. Are you coachable? Are they going to sit there and argue with me over everything? Are they going to act embarrassed? Or are they going to own up and say, yeah, I screwed that up? I think that tells you a lot about their character. I think that tells you a lot about their ability to be trained into the tougher, higher proficiency levels.
And a little thing on that, like in terms of the willing to accept risk thing, like let's say we disagree with the person. a lot of times what you'll see is a candidate who really wants to save face. And so they'll argue with you, but also what they're trying to do is mitigate or diminish the things that were in their control or that were errors on their part, right? And a person who's willing to be like, you know what, I own this and accept that's a level of risk, right? Like I own everything bad that happened that's overshadowed by these other things that I think I did well, but it doesn't matter because I fucked this other thing up. Like, willing to accept that is a big deal. So hopefully what we've done this last hour or so is given you some food for thought that you can incorporate into how you run your selection and recruiting process. And one thing that I think that is important to remember is that there's a difference between testing and training, right? Like in dog training, we do this all the time. Are you testing the dog or are you training the dog? That applies to people too. And you need to be intentional about that. One of the things about our SWAT school that we run, which is different than others, presumably, right, is that we are teaching a ton of new stuff. Every candidate that comes through the door, they're learning things that are completely foreign to them. They've never thrown a flashbang before. They've never shot some of this less lethal. They've never done vehicle assaults or hostage rescues, or all these things are completely foreign to them. And we plan ahead for that, knowing that they've never seen this before. We incorporate that crawl, walk, run modality, right? Like that approach. And we're careful to not over-evaluate just whether or not they get something technically or procedurally correct. Do I care that you got like the angles perfectly the right exact way in a vehicle assault or whatever? Yeah, I mean, that matters. To some degree, it matters, right? But more importantly, how well do they respond to making those mistakes? And how well are they able to improve or bounce back from those mistakes, right? If I give them that feedback, can they retain the information and can they implement that and apply it to their performance in the future? I can handle someone who's a slow learner. Like if I have to take more time with them, not a big deal, as long as they're still learning. If you get an attitude with me, if you shut down over failure, if you start beating yourself up so much that like you just can't get back in the zone, that's a bigger problem, right? And you really have to emphasize those soft skills, those personality traits over some of those hard skills. What is the type of person you want on your team? Is it someone who is good at problem solving and has a growth mindset and is resilient and resourceful? To me, that always sounds more appealing than someone who is just a good shooter and a PT stud. Good shooter, PT stud is cool, but those other things I can go a lot farther with. And finally, make sure that whatever metrics you're picking people with are things that are also reflected in the culture and the ethos of your team or your organization, whatever that is. Having high standards and seeking excellence is good, right? That's great. Like, we want that. But it's also something that's ongoing, and it doesn't only happen at selection. Good teams are groups who can self-regulate, and I think being able to self-regulate is a big trait in building your culture, holding each other accountable, and that means a degree of personal investment and responsibility to the success of the team.
I like that. Put your money where your mouth is, lead by example. I think those are good points.
Yeah.
Well put. My final thoughts, talent management is huge, and you need to consider that comprehensive life cycle for your membership. You need a really clear concept of when you're teaching and when you're evaluating, and honestly, so do your candidates. It will change what they do, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse, but it will change what they do if they know they're getting graded at that moment. And as we talk about this, I'm struck by the soft truths, the special operations forces truths. Now, not everything in the military applies to law enforcement or applies to civilian concealed carry, right? There is some overlap, but it's not a perfect overlap. But this is an area where I think we really could push some lessons from one to the other. So this is doctrine from U.S. Special Operations Forces. You can go find it on SOCOM.mil. It's like publicly available. And it is lessons learned and relearned over and over through the history of special operations. There's 5 core truths, fundamental truisms that they have found over and over and over. 1, humans are more important than hardware. That's why it's part of our logo. People, ideas, hardware, always, right?
It's like we've heard that before.
So if you have a choice between putting time, effort, and money into a new scope for the guns or better training for the dudes and the gals, put it into the humans, right? Number 2, quality is better than quantity. I would rather have a smaller team of more effective, safer operators than a big team of losers. Okay. Number 3, special operations forces cannot be mass produced. You can't just run a factory that spits out ninjas. It just doesn't work that way. I've seen too many James Bond movies where that doesn't work. Okay. Number 4, competent special operations forces cannot be created after the emergency occurs. If you wait for the hostage event, if you wait for the big one, you're too late. You got to start doing it now.
You're looking for unicorns.
Yep. And number 5, most special operations require support from non-special operations. And as this relates to law enforcement, I would think real hard about the relationship between the SWAT team and the patrol guys. And if you have a good, strong, healthy relationship, patrol should be talent scouting for you, finding the guys who are good candidates and prepping them because, hey, you're going to go to SWAT school, you're repping our division, right? You know, ops division, northeast, southwest, whatever. You represent me when you go to that school. Let's get you ready.
Yeah, I like that because it also speaks to don't be a dick. And as far as the life cycle thing goes, it's remembering that, like, hey, just because you're here, like, we joke sometimes that, like, you're not special, dude. It's like, yes, I am. It says so right in the name. But, like, really, you're not, right? Like, you're not special. You're another person. You just have a unique job. Like, you have a special job, but you're not that special of a person. And you need to, like, see it as in that, like, humble sort of sense, like, don't be a dick. And it also will feed into that, like, talent life cycle thing where you want people to, like, think that SWAT is cool, think that the special teams are cool in my world, right? And part of the way that you do that is portray yourself as a worthy cause, right? A leader and a mentor and a coach and someone worth going to for advice.
I think that's about all I got. Be safe out there. Be smart out there. If you like what we're doing, consider giving us a rating on whatever podcast app you're using. That helps us reach out to potential listeners who haven't found us yet. And thank you.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.